Okay, so I'm introducing Ciaran, who's going to speak for 20 minutes on Gaza, and then we can follow that with a discussion. Okay, go on, Ciaran.
Okay, thank you, Pam. Maybe 25 minutes, maybe a little bit longer.
All right.
Uh, it's quite a small group of comrades, but I think that will probably help to enrich the discussion. Comrades will be able to come in more than once, and I think that sometimes that's important.
Yes, yes.
In a sense, this is an update, but I don't plan to go through events on a day-by-day basis or to really get into the detail of what's happened. Comrades know this. Comrades are following the news very closely and have a good understanding of how events have unfolded. So we'll deal with events relatively quickly, but then I will move on to perspectives for our view, our collective view as to what might happen next and the future, and in particular the role of workers, activists, socialists and Marxists in intervening both in their home country, but also intervening in the sense that we intervene as internationalists, that we have a view, we take a world view, and we take a view on events in other places, and we seek in our own way to influence events. And I'll explain more what I mean by that. That's the purpose. And I will deal with some very specific questions towards the end, not to necessarily give easy solutions, but to throw up some of the more complicated issues around the Israeli-Palestine question. So, for example, the question of the right of return, the Palestinian refugees and their descendants, or the law of return, whereby people of Jewish descent, as Roger talked about a couple of weeks ago, can decide to relocate to Israel and take Israeli citizenship. There are just some very difficult issues for us to discuss as socialists, and some of the most complex facing socialists and facing humanity are centered in the Middle East, and in particular in Israel, Palestine. So I think a good discussion around some of these issues will be very helpful. I will, to an extent, reference some of the other kind of live national questions on the planet at the present time, not least Ireland, where there are certain points of comparison. It's very, very different in very many ways, but there are points of comparison, but also other places on the planet, and it might be useful to think about points of comparison, analogies, when we're trying to find a way forward. Now, in terms of events, as I say, I don't plan to go into any detail about what has unfolded between October the 7th and today, but I think we should, in every discussion, cast our minds backwards to the past, the recent past, the last 25 years, and in particular the period of time since the Oslo Accords of 1993 and 1995, which were agreements that were brokered by international imperialism, the United States of America primarily, and which seemed to point the way forward to an outline of a potential solution, in that there would be a sense of coexistence, that the Palestinian leadership, the PLO and the Israeli state would agree that each had rights, each had a say in the future, and that over a period of time, the outline of a Palestinian state, an independent Palestinian state, would develop. That was never formally part of the Oslo Accords. It was never said in that way that there would be a Palestinian state, but it was commonly understood that would be the outcome. And that's why we had the development at the end of the last century, the first few years, the beginning of this century, of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Gaza, and the withdrawal of Israel from Gaza, for example, where there were some isolated settlements. They were evacuated in the early part of this century. So for a period of time, there appeared to be hope that there would be a better future. But as we know, as the world knows, that hopes were dashed. And over the course of the last 20 years, rather than moving in the direction of peace, there has been increased division, increased tension, increased conflict, and what appears to be a hardening of attitudes on both sides. So in the Palestinian Authority region, the West Bank and Gaza, Hamas came to power in 2007, ejected Fatah, the PLO main faction, from the West Bank from Gaza through force of arms, and established their own regime, which has existed down to this day. So today we have two, if you like, Palestinian authorities, one in Gaza run by Hamas, and there have been no elections since 2007. And similarly in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority led by Mahmoud Abbas, from the Fatah faction of the PLO, and again, there have been no elections since 2007. Both Hamas and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank neither command the majority support in their areas. The last time there was an opinion poll within the last year, which is taken to be reasonably accurate, Hamas had 43% support in the Gaza Strip, the Gaza territories, which is quite high compared to bourgeois governments internationally, but nevertheless is much less than half of the population. But the Palestinian Authority had even less support, on 26% of the Palestinian residents of the West Bank, again with little authority and little standing amongst the mass of workers and the rural poor. On the other side of the fences of the borders in the Israeli state, as we all know, the most right-wing reactionary government in the history of the state has now come to power. Bibi Netanyahu, who was a holdout, a rejectionist at the time of the Oslo Accords, has now come to power as prime minister for the fifth time, I think, with the support of hard right religious parties which have never been in power before, which take a very hardline position on all of the relevant issues. So the world expected an increase in tension and conflict because of the coming to power of the Netanyahu fifth government. And indeed, for the first part of this year, there was increased conflict, in particular in the West Bank, where hardline right-wing settlers appeared to be emboldened. The leash was taken off and they were attacking their Palestinian neighbours without any sense of repercussions. And it was expected that there would be an outbreak of worse violence at a certain point, most likely in the West Bank. So what was unexpected was where the flashpoint came, that it was the Gaza-Israeli state border. And also what was unexpected was the military success of Hamas. So it was a military success. They cut the border fence in maybe 10 or 12 places. They took control of part of the state of Israel for at least one day, but in some places for more than one day. They inflicted a military defeat on the Israeli state in the sense that nearly 300 soldiers were killed. And in fact, more soldiers from the elite Golani Brigade were killed on October the 7th and were killed in the 1967 and the 1973 wars combined. But of course, overshadowing all of that was the massacre of civilians, the deliberate massacre of civilians, including at the outdoor festival, but also in the kibbutz, in homes, and in workplaces right across the area. Now, the fog of war means we can't be clear about what had happened exactly, how many soldiers died, how many civilians, how many children, what is the manner of death, were some of the more barbaric methods of killing people that were employed, is that accurate or not accurate? I think we know that the Israeli state has reasons to exaggerate and probably has exaggerated. We also know that Hamas perhaps will try and hide some of what has occurred because it's clear that Hamas would prefer there to be more focus on its military success and less focus on its massacre of civilians. But it is clear the civilians were massacred, non-combatants were deliberately targeted, and we are not in favour of the deliberate targeting of non-combatants. We are opposed to it, and we should say we're opposed to it in public. But we're also opposed to it not simply because it's non-combatants should not be targeted in this manner, but because it has proven to be counterproductive in the past and has been counterproductive again on this occasion. After October the 7th, the Israeli state, as we know, launched an onslaught on Gaza. They sealed the entire strip off, and they've imposed medieval siege conditions on the people. And paradoxically, it's conditions of medieval siege where there's no water, no fuel, no electricity, and simultaneously the most high-tech weapons on the planet have been employed to rain down the fire on the people of Gaza. And as of this afternoon, the death toll in Gaza is 9,770. I think that's the last figure. It'll hit 10,000 within the coming hours, probably by tomorrow morning. The vast majority of whom are civilians, non-combatants, 40% of whom are children. And the world, the vast majority of people across the world have been outraged by the actions of the Israeli state. Now, there's nothing new in this. The Israeli state has acted in such a manner before. It has massacred thousands of Palestinian civilians in Lebanon, in the Gaza Strip, and in the West Bank over the course of the last three generations. But the scale of the attack on this occasion is unsurpassed. The Israeli state has made it clear that it intends to smash Hamas to ensure that Hamas is no longer a viable organization. And it has said that publicly and said repeatedly that it will not pull back to its own borders until it's achieved that aim. Now, whether it'll achieve that aim or not is a very open question, because already it has killed 10,000 civilians, mainly civilians, but the impact on Hamas as a fighting organisation is probably limited. It needs to go in on the ground. It needs to fight street by street and tunnel by tunnel. And when it does so, it will take serious casualties. By yesterday, 23 Israeli soldiers had been killed. And again, on a day-to-day basis, that number will rise. When it finally does withdraw and probably creates a new buffer zone, the question is, what will it do next? The indications are that the Israeli state hopes to smash Hamas and hopes perhaps to reimpose the authority of the Mahmoud Abbas regime in the West Bank. Some form of Palestinian authority returns, probably with some underpinnings from some of the Arab states, which are more sympathetic to Israel, if you like, the ones that have formed links with Israel and are more opposed to Hamas, and Hamas, of course, being an Iranian-backed organization. That's the Israeli hope, that it smashes Hamas, it creates a new buffer zone, that the people of Gaza are cowed, and some type of new regime is imposed, which will keep peace in the area for the period ahead, for the years ahead. But that is likely to be a forlorn hope. It is most likely that at some point the Israeli state will have to call a ceasefire and will withdraw, with only some of its aims met, that Hamas will not be destroyed, though maybe severely weakened for a period of time. Imposing a new regime, a new governmental structure on the Gaza Strip will be very, very difficult. So they may withdraw and leave the conditions of chaos and instability, or perhaps Hamas returns in some form, or perhaps there's some kind of an uneasy position where there is some form of new regime backed by other Arab states, perhaps underpinned by imperialism in some way, but Hamas continues to exist and the two groupings sit side by side with each other. Simultaneously, of course, Hamas has been bolstered by events, now has more support from Palestinians than it had before, including in the West Bank, and it may paradoxically be weakened in the Gaza Strip over the course of the next period, but be strengthened in the West Bank and challenge the regime in the West Bank. But we can say, whatever the outcome, from the point of view of the Israeli state and Hamas and Western imperialism, the losers will be the people of the Gaza Strip. Many, many thousands and more will die. The majority of homes and businesses and workplaces in the area will be damaged or destroyed, and what will be left afterwards will be a wasteland. In that context, it has already been raised in the international media that there is a possibility of a new peace process, that in the aftermath of such a shocking event, that there will be renewed impetus for a peace process. And we can't exclude that possibility. The possibility that the sense of shock means that some of the key players return to the table. I think that largely depends on how the various leading forces, what are the leading forces in the aftermath of these events. So Bibi Netanyahu, for example, and his government, will his government survive? Will he survive as prime minister? Could there be a move from the right towards the centre ground in the Israeli state, and a new government emerges, which is more of the centre ground and is more open to negotiations? If Hamas is seriously damaged, would the Palestinian Authority have the authority to enter into negotiations? And all of this, of course, is absolutely conditional. But the idea of a new peace process, it is entirely possible, and we have to be alert to that possibility. If it does develop, the proposals on the table will still be the two-state solution. But by the two-state solution, what those around the negotiation table will mean, of course, is a two-state solution under capitalism. And we can say that under capitalism, within the capitalist system, a two-state solution is no solution, and that under capitalism, there is no solution. But that doesn't simply mean that we ask the workers and the rural poor in the region to simply wait for a socialist future, and we do not hold out any hope for any advance or any positive steps that can be taken in the interim period. And what we have to say as socialists is that it's not just the victory of socialism, but the struggle for socialism that holds out hope for the working masses in the area. Because the struggle for socialism is by definition a united struggle. So if the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza enter into struggle and over the course of the next period and begin to rebuild a leadership that is worthy of the name, then that opens up the possibility of a solution in the future. Now, the question has arisen, I'm very mindful of time already, that's 17 and a half minutes, I think. How long has it been, Pam?
You've got about 11 to go.
But 11 to go. Okay, so very mindful of time. So, from the point of view of comrades on this call and the international workers' movement, one of the key issues for us is how we intervene, how we intervene as activists and as socialists. We should not have the view that the international workers' movement is in any way neutral in these events. Of course, it's not. The international workers' movement has to come down primarily on the side of the oppressed. And the oppressed in this context is the Palestinian masses, the workers in the rural poor in the Palestinian areas. That is why it's important for the international workers' movement, for trade unions, and for left parties to be present on all of the demonstrations and to put forward an alternative. But the alternative must be that not only in the alternative, what we must say is that a solution on capitalism is not possible, but a social solution is possible, but it has to be fought for in the here and now. And what we mean by that is that in every demonstration, we of course echo the immediate demands, and the immediate demands are for a ceasefire, for a withdrawal of the Israeli state forces from all of the occupied territories, and for an end to the blockade. And those are demands that are absolute and have to be realised. We would add to those demands the role of the workers' movement as an important lever on a world scale. So, for example, if workers in any part of the planet take action to prevent the shipment of arms to the Israeli state, that would have a very important ripple effect on workers in other places, and ultimately could be the lever by which the Israeli state has to pull back if it is no longer guaranteed a shipment of arms. So we raise the issue on the demonstrations that only the workers' movement can actually deliver on the demand for a ceasefire. Otherwise, it is a shouting phrases into the thin air, which will be ignored by imperialism and the Israeli state. But we have to go beyond immediate demands, and we have to raise programmatic demands about the way forward, the way out. And that's where I just want to deal quickly with this question of a one-state solution or a two-state solution, which is a live debate, not just for the capitalist class, but it's a live debate in the international socialist movement. The one-state solution implies that there's a single unitary state on the borders of the old Palestinian mandate. So Israel proper, as it were, the West Bank and Gaza, a single unitary state, which is secular and in which people from a Jewish background and a Palestinian background and from other backgrounds live together as equal citizens. That, as a capitalist state, is unrealizable. Under socialism, it is realizable, but we have to ask the question of how do we get to that point. From the point of view of socialism, we're in favour of maximum unity across all borders and all boundaries. All borders and all boundaries ultimately for us are irrelevant, except in the sense of administrative boundaries, because we're for the greatest unity of people possible. Socialists should be in favour of larger unitary states, because larger unitary states are more efficient, more effective, and more likely to deliver a way out from the poverty and the unemployment and the uncertainty and hopelessness of capitalism. But we accept that in the short to medium term, there is the need for national boundaries, because the national identity of different peoples and communities and nations is important. Ian, you have your hand up. Do you want to?
No, it's okay. You finish first, Ciaran,
Okay,
then I'll stop bringing people in.
Okay. Yeah. We accept that in the short to medium term, obviously, that national boundaries do exist, and the way forward in the national question means taking account of the actual reality of what we find on the ground. So in the question of Israel-Palestine, Marxists, socialists were opposed to the foundation of the Israeli state in 1948, but we recognize that in the 3 generations since, in the 75 years since, that an Israeli national Jewish consciousness has developed, and that we cannot ignore that there are 7.5 million Jews who live in Israel, 80% of whom were born in Israel and no other home and will not be leaving the area. We know that the consciousness of the Jewish working class has been shaped by the wars of 1948, 56, 67, and 1973, and all of the events since that time, the interventions into Lebanon, the clashes with the Hezbollah and with Hamas over the course of the last decades. So their consciousness is as an embattled nation, an embattled nation state, which has to defend itself and can only be sure of its future if it maintains its own borders and its own boundaries into the future. On the other hand, the Palestinian masses, the Palestinian working class, suffered a catastrophe, which is what they call it, in 1948, a catastrophe like few others on the planet in the history of humanity. They lost most of their land. They lost their historic places of life. That a majority went into refugee camps, and their children still live in the refugee camps. A few tens of thousands of the pre-1948 residents still live on today, but many millions of their descendants live on in the refugee camps in the neighbouring Arab countries. The Palestinian masses deserve and want a home of their own, a homeland of their own, and they're entitled to such. And we would support the right to self-determination and the right to an independent homeland. So the question is how, in the short term, we are to realise these demands, and whether the question of or the slogan of a one-state solution or the slogan of a two-state solution, two socialist states side by side, is the more appropriate way and manner in which to approach Jewish workers and Jewish Israeli workers and Palestinian workers and demonstrators around the world, in order to convince workers that under socialism that a solution is possible. I would argue that a two-state solution, two socialist states sitting side by side, as a slogan and is the way to approach the current consciousness of workers in the region. We ultimately are in favour of a single unitary state in the region, but the way to get to a single unitary state where Jews and Palestinians live side by side is to allow the interim solution of two states, two socialist states. I think that's the point that we should put forward. If we were going to begin to raise these demands, we have to think about all of the complications, the obvious complications, because what workers will say, they say, well, is a two-state solution possible, given the settlement program in the West Bank in particular, which has been enacted over the course of the last 25 years. There's now 500,000 Israeli Jews living in the West Bank. They control all the best land. They control the road network, as has been described recently by other comrades. And the idea of a continuous strip of land in the West Bank that can be formed the basis of the Palestinian state no longer exists. We would have to say that in the context of the development of a struggle for socialism and moving towards a social solution, that there would have to be transfer of populations in that context. Either Israeli Jews would return to Israel proper, or Israeli Jews would have to agree to live in a majority Palestinian state for a period of time, even if their aspiration in the future was to belong to a single unitary state. And that's this creative thinking that we have to begin thinking about at this stage, because that's the sort of questions that workers will ask. Similarly, on the right of return, the right of return is the right of Palestinians who were evicted from their land in 1948 to return, or for their descendants to return to their property, to their land, to their villages and their towns. The right of return is recognised by some international authorities, but it's not recognised by the Israeli state for obvious reasons, except as a bargaining chip, a bargaining counter in negotiations. We would have to argue the right of return is a right, but how it will actually be enacted is an open question and will vary from population to population, from person to person. There will, of course, be some Palestinians who don't wish to return. There will be some who do wish to return, and it is a viable option for them to return, depending on where they wish to return to. For others, the right to return, in essence, will be replaced to a right to compensation for what has been lost. And again, that means what many consider to be an absolute right can only actually be enacted in the sense of compromise and agreement. Even more difficult is the law of return. The law of return of the Israeli state, which says that any Jew anywhere on the planet, either a Jew in the Orthodox religious sense or a Jew in the more secular sense, in the sense that it depends on ancestry, whether it's a female line or male line, has the right to return to the Israeli state and take Israeli citizenship. And we'd have to say, in the struggle for socialism and in the unfolding of socialism, that the law of return would have to be checked and could no longer simply be allowed to happen in the sense that has happened over the course of the decades. There's people all over the planet, of course, can move from one country to another, and that happens, but this sense of an absolute right, and a right which can only be enacted or only have been enacted over the course of the last decades to the detriment of Palestinians can no longer be allowed. And finally, the question of resources, because the national question area is a question of identity, but it's also a question of resources, which is why we've always made the point that the unresolved national questions cannot be resolved under capitalism, because the national question in many ways is about a competition over scarce resources, no more so than in the Middle East and in Israel-Palestine, where the key resources are the land and water supplies. And the Israeli state has prospered, not just with American subvention and with the inflow of capital, but also because it has taken the best land and has taken the water resources and impoverished its Palestinian neighbours by doing so. So any move towards a solution must mean that there's a sharing out of resources on an equal, equitable basis. Otherwise, there is no way forward, and there would be no sense in which a viable Palestinian state can be created. There's a number of points I was going to make, comrades, but I think I'm probably just about at time now, so I'll draw to a conclusion at that point. I'm feeling a bit under the weather today. I may have noticed, like, I don't feel terribly well, but I'm definitely going to stay here for this discussion now, but I'm not just flowing the way I might like. In terms of written material, the comrades will probably have already seen, I'm affiliated to the International Standpoint website, and comrades will have already seen that we have some material from the early days of the conflict, written by comrades from the International Standpoint group. Nigel has an article posted in the course of the last 10 days, mostly with the situation in Britain, the anti-war movement. Rogers posted an article on the website in the course of the last week. And the last few days, Andros has published a long article, or 3 long articles, which are an analysis of events over the course of the last period. And by maybe an hour by the end of this meeting, a longer article written by myself, a more analytical article, will also be posted. So, comrades, we can't discuss everything here today in this discussion, but we can discuss it. We can come back in further discussions, and comrades can examine the written material when they find time in the next few days. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Ciaran. That's a lot of ideas for comrades to consider. I've got one hand up so far. Put your hand up if you want to speak. Just try and stick to about 5 minutes. We've got quite a small meeting, so there should be time for people to sort of come back and respond to things, really. So, Ian.
Hi, yeah. Sorry, Ciaran, first of all, I put my hand up quite early. It's when you were getting into the one state, two state stuff. I thought I want to be one of the first to join the discussion, but certainly didn't want to jump in and cut you off mid stride. I liked your initial invitation to analogies for other live national questions on the planet near near the start of your talk. The one that I was really thinking about since this all started in Gaza is Nagorno-Karabakh in Armenia, Azerbaijan, one of the longest running former Soviet disputes that's been solved in the worst possible way for the people on the ground. Just a few weeks before the Gaza events kicked off, in a one-day war, the Azerbaijani state, with the support of Turkey, the historical support of imperialism, Russia standing aside, the idiocy of the Armenian government that had accepted Russian peacekeepers, then did joint military exercises with the Americans, and maybe they thought they were playing both sides. I think they just isolated themselves from both. And the upshot of it all is, in less than a day, complete military victory for the state and ethnic cleansing of the people of the area. And it's a smaller population than Gaza, about 100,000, just over 100,000. But the last I saw, almost all of them are now in Armenia proper. And it all happened quite quickly and with little international fanfare. Even though this had been a very long-running dispute, there have been major wars about it in the 80s and 90s and again in the last few years. But it seems that a genocide has been carried out, a new Armenian genocide has been carried out just this year. And that was one of the big worries about Gaza, that the idea of pushing the whole population of Gaza into Egypt, reoccupying it, maybe resettling it. Of course, that would be madness, even from an Israeli point of view, but it was in the Smotrich plan, published by one of these new right-wing, far right-wing ministers. That would be madness in the Israeli view that never had big settlements in Gaza before. It was quite convenient to them to use as an open-air prison camp. Sisi is one of their biggest props in the region, and they would totally destabilize his regime in Egypt. But nonetheless, these people are fanatics who want every inch of the land on principle to settle. And although it seems that they've blinked from genocide, for now, took longer than it looked likely at first for the ground invasion to begin, and so on. It's still by far the bloodiest of the one report said 5 wars in Gaza this century. I think there's different ways of counting. There's been so many flare-ups. It's restored the disproportionate death count between Israel and Palestine, which seems to be one of the aims even of the operation. And it's it's not done yet in terms of the possibility of escalation. I saw just this afternoon that Netanyahu had reprimanded one of his other further right ministers for calling for nuclear weapons to be used on Gaza. When you think how small the whole area is, I think that wouldn't be very good for Israel proper in terms of the fallout. But as I say, there's a lot of fanaticism, especially on the Israeli government side. And so I think in terms of so that was my analogy, and the real threat that I think has prompted so much world action, especially across the Western world, the heartlands of imperialism and of Israel's biggest allies, is this threat of genocide. It's unfortunate that the Armenian events were so fast and obscure that it didn't have the same effect there. But in terms of the one state, two state debate, I've been for a long time a supporter of one state. I think it's important to say in these heightened times that that's nothing about anyone in Israel currently having to leave. It's totally about dismantling a system of apartheid, free elections and democratic rights for everyone in the area, as well as you correctly pointed out, the right of return for the refugees. I'd go a little bit further. I'd say that it is a right of return or compensation, but only compensation in the sense that some people won't want to return. And of course, nobody should be left stateless. So anyone currently a refugee without nationality in the surrounding countries who wants to stay in them should, of course, become a Jordanian, Syrian, Lebanese citizen and so on instead. No one should be left stateless out of this. Everyone has the right to return, not necessarily to their old house because so many of them have been destroyed, but certainly to the bounds of their country, and in order to have a say in its future. If they come to the conclusion that a two-state solution is necessary, that's fine. But I do worry with the idea of it's impossible under capitalism, because political apartheid in South Africa is gone, sadly, under capitalism, with all the social and economic apartheid that brings with it. But the political system did go. It went at peak neoliberalism in 1994, so it's a different situation in the world today. But I do think that we can't rule out the possibility of a one-state solution under capitalism. A two-state solution under capitalism, on the other hand, would be one state and some Bantustans that it exploits. So I think that's a legitimate thing to say in terms of a two-state solution under capitalism. I might come in again later, but I'll stop for now.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, all right. Some hands came up and went down. Finn, do you want to go next?
Comrades, I want to begin by thanking Ciaran for a stimulating and interesting opening contribution. There's agreement amongst the comrades about the actions and attitudes of the Israeli government. We don't need to go into detail there. We're all marching around in favour of the rights of Palestinian people in our various cities and locations. There's agreement on that front. But I want to raise a question about Hamas. It's a disaster for the Palestinian people that Hamas has got into the position that it's got in terms of Palestinians. They're a vicious, sectarian, cruel, repressive organization. And the only reason they're in power now although there hasn't been an election, as Ciaran has explained, for many, many years, is because of the complete failure of the PLO and al-Fatah to solve the problems of the Palestinian people. But Hamas itself is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood was formed in 1928 in Egypt by a character called al-Banna, and the purpose of that organization was to oppose the development of secular and socialist organizations and thinking and ideas within the Arab struggles at the time. The Muslim Brotherhood, you'll remember, were involved in the Arab Spring in Egypt, in overturning the democratic will of the people at that time. They represent a right-wing trend within Islam. Hamas itself stands for the establishment of an Islamic republic, although that's a very, very foolish combination. It's widely used. A country can't be simultaneously a republic and Islamic, although that's a term that's used obviously in Iran. But nonetheless, Hamas stands for the Islamicization of the entire area of the old mandate. They want Israel to become a Sharia state. They want the entire mandate territory, which stretches from Jordan across to Israel itself, to become an Islamic state with Sharia law. Not just that, but in line with their mentors, the Muslim Brotherhood, they want the entire globe to become an Islamicized series of states. So it's unfortunate that the people of Palestine are stuck with this crowd, as I say, because of the failures of the PLO. But it's not just the PLO. One of the issues about Palestine is the complete failure of all the various leaderships that thrust themselves to the fore over the years. After 1948, or following the declaration of partition, Arab armies took on themselves, like, for instance, Jordan, Lebanon, other countries, Egypt, that they would resolve the question. And all they did was seize land for themselves. Jordan took the land on the other side of the river, and it was Transjordan that became Jordan. Egypt took Gaza, and the countries looked after themselves. At the present time, the United States and other countries, and the UK, and for that matter, the EU, who had intervened, had their own objectives. The Arab states, as they exist today, as Bahrain and Kuwait and Saudi and Egypt, for that matter, and the rest of them, their only interest in the situation is establishing trade relationships with Israel and maintaining the position in world capitalism. They don't have any interest in solving the questions of the Palestinian people. The other organizations like the PLO, for example, al-Fatah and other constituents, and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which had a kind of a socialist bent for a while and captured the attention of socialists internationally. Nonetheless, they solved nothing either. And the Palestinian Authority, as Ciaran explained, which came from the Oslo Accords, has solved nothing. Unemployment, alienation, all the other problems all continue to exist. And in addition to that, they're now also an arm of the Israeli state because they enforce Israeli security procedures within the West Bank. I saw it myself. I was there, and a lot of the roadblocks and searches and all that are conducted by officials of the Palestinian Authority, even though the area that they control is very, very small. 2/3 of the territory of the West Bank is controlled directly by Egypt in terms of military and administrative measures. It's very important that the left is clear on the role that Hamas is playing. Hamas is not a liberation movement that the left has to support, not at all. We have to oppose Hamas, oppose them openly and forthrightly because of what they represent. There's nothing that they have in common with the socialist movement. The massacre of civilians in Israel has nothing in common with our traditions. The kidnapping of civilians and the holding of hostages as bargaining chips has nothing whatever in common with our socialist traditions. And all the hostages should be released unconditionally. That demand shouldn't be left to the likes of the United States and the UK to call for it. We should call for it as socialists and democrats. The unconditional release of civilian hostages. We call for a ceasefire, even though Hamas don't want a ceasefire. Hamas want to continue to struggle until Israel is destroyed, which is an absolutely foolish and fantastical objective. They'll continue to struggle until such time as the entire area becomes Sharia, run by Sharia law. We can't have anything in common with that. There's nothing in common between the Hamas and us. No, as I said at the outset, we all agree about the crimes of Israel. There's no ambiguity about that. We're opposed to the continuing slaughter and the destruction, the blockades, the failure to allow hospitals to run and people to live. All that we're in agreement about. But we need to be clearer in our thinking and in our open work about the role that Hamas plays, and in particular to spell out that they are a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a right-wing organization which represented landlords and the more conservative layers within Islam. Now, that's not to say that the PLO have an answer either. They don't. On the contrary, the current Fatah movement in the West Bank is extremely unpopular. Now, the way to advance is very, very difficult. I mean, there is a socialist and trade union tradition in many of the Arab countries. There have been socialist movements and communist parties with significant influence at various times in a lot of countries, such as Egypt, Lebanon, and others. There were, from time to time, socialist and left-wing communist organizations developing. Even going back to the days of the pre-Man days at times, back in the 30s. I mean, the Arab revolt was stimulated first by a general strike of Arabs. There was strikes, actually, even in the newly established state of Israel. There were strikes which united Arab and Jewish workers together in places like Haifa and in the concrete and cement industry in parts of Israel. Now, the Histadrut, which was the kind of Zionist aspect of the labor organization, worked to oppose that and to break and to prevent that unity, and they were successful in so doing. But nonetheless, Palestinian workers and Arab workers continued to organize through trade unions at various times. So there is a tradition there that can be built upon. And what needs to be done now is to seek out links between workers in the countries of Egypt, Israel, the West Bank, and other places where workers can unite around common class issues. Now, Israel have just now kicked out several thousand of Gazan workers. 20,000 workers from Gaza had permits to work in Israel on construction and agriculture. When I was in Bethlehem, every morning at 5 o'clock, thousands of workers from Bethlehem would go through like cages and security cordons to go about their work in Israel, and then take another load of time to come back.
Can you have had a good 5 minutes now?
Oh, yes. Sorry, Fam. I'll finish up on that. So we're all in agreement about the role of Israel, and I think we need to be more forthright and more open in our criticism of Hamas, what they represent. Not just the actions, the brutality they're responsible for, but also what they represent and what their objectives are in this ongoing struggle.
Okay, thanks, Finn. Peter.
All right, comrades, thanks. Firstly, let's get one or two historical facts right here. Israel was ceded by the British in 1948 as to become a sovereign state, ratified by the UN, as far as my memory serves me right. Right from that very year, 1948, the Nakba immediately began. Well, in December, I think it was. From that time to the present time, which is now 75 years, the Palestinians have suffered at the hands of the Zionist Israeli state, probably for most days of those 75 years, pushed into now a tiny corner of Gaza. The Israeli state tell them to move north, it'll be safer, they bomb it. Tell them to move south, to be safer, they bomb it. This is genocide. There's no ifs or buts about it. Now let's get this business of Hamas out of the way. Hamas wasn't formed until 1987. It was formed as a result of the direct action by the then Zionist government upon the Palestinians. It just didn't materialize itself. It was formed because of the Zionist oppression of the Palestinians in their own country. With regard to the setting up of a one or two party state, let's make this perfectly clear too. It's not Hamas that's the aggressor. They have been oppressed by the Zionist regime of Israel. who is the aggressor. You try and talk to people like Netanyahu, who wants the war to continue, and he's made it perfectly clear. And in the last few days, one of his senior ministers mentioned an atomic bomb. You can't get a 1 or 2 party state in Israel unless you remove the problem. And the problem is Zionism. That's the problem. It's not a religion. And I'll bet you, now I've been to Israel 30 odd years ago, and I spent some time there listening to ordinary Israelis, if there's such a thing, many who are religious, and they talk in quiet hush when they're talking to foreigners like me. Because I got the impression that they were frightened, they were scared of speaking out. It may be a wrong impression, but that's the impression. And my wife got, and other people with us, they got the same impression too. So this has gone on for far too long. And let's stop calling it a war. It is not a war. You don't take on one of the world's mightiest countries with bows and arrows, because Hamas are only a minute comparison to an enormous Israeli army, 300,000 as I understand, are along the Gaza Strip. So we're talking about literally the return of David versus Goliath. That's the situation we're in here. And as I said, and as I'll keep repeating until the cows come home, the problem is Zionism. And the only way you can resolve that problem is remove the problem, and that's Zionism. How you do that is another matter. I haven't a clue. The only thing I could say is, if the religious Jews, which I'm sure outnumber the Zionist Jews by something like 80 to 20, pull together, then perhaps you might get short of a Zionist regime and replace it with a proper democratic government, which Israel desperately needs. Desperately needs, not just for themselves, but for the Palestinians too. I'll finish here. Now, the fact of it is, I said the last time I spoke, who's next? The real Zionists? The real Jews? It wouldn't put it past me, because already getting beaten up by the special branch of the cops over there. So that would not... I shake my head with anger about Zionists and what they've been doing over the years. And people just think they are the oppressors. They're the oppressed. They're the aggressors. Thanks, comrades.
Okay, thanks, Peter. John or Dominic?
Dominic, it's just a few thoughts. I was just looking at what happened last Friday. I know Finn says we don't want to be going over it, but I think at times it does you a bit of good to look at what's happening and what people are doing about it. On Friday, you got Blinken, who's the Secretary of State for the US, going over with a message of total support for the Israelis government, and just saying to them, look, can you cut it out a bit about bombing all these civilians, make it look a bit better? Netanyahu's response to that was that on the same day he made a speech to his armed forces, and he referred to what he said was, remember what Amak did to you. And basically this is a reference from the Bible, Book of Saul, where God told the Israelites to go and smite Amak. But what he said was, now go and smite Amak and utterly destroy what they have, and spare them not, but slay both men and women, infants and sucklings, ox and sheep, camel and ass. So what basically you've got a situation is in Netanyahu's mindset to his troops is total genocide of the Palestinians, particularly in the Gaza Strip. And what you see in is carpet bombing of hospitals, bombing of ambulances, bombing of schools, bombing of the fishing fleet, bombing of bakeries, all part of this scenario. Now, you've got the Western capitalists, the democracies, and speaking to Israel as a democracy, they're saying, just cool it a bit. The Arab nations in the area that have got the power are either feudal or semi-feudal dictatorships or military dictatorships. You've got Iran, Hezbollah, sort of saying, we're not getting involved. And when it comes to Hamas, Hamas would have a state something to the right of what is in Iran. Now, would we support the imposition of that sort of a state on any country in the world? There's no, I mean, we were only discussing some months ago the struggle of the Iranian people against their own regime. And you're getting a touch of that in Israel. It's, to my mind, it's exceptional that you'll see during a war that people will come out on the streets and argue for the government to go. It's over the question of hostages, but it just shows you that what the situation in Israel and what potential there could be over time. So I think Finn's absolutely right. Hamas is no solution. Capitalism is no solution. The Arab states are no solution. The United Nations is it's just a sounding gong. The leaders of that are trying to make a point that this massacres have got to stop, but they're totally powerless. It's up to the major powers to decide what happens in this world as far as they're concerned, and that is obviously what we're opposing. So the whole thing is a real difficult process. But I think one of the things you've got to start saying is that the workers in Europe, the workers in the rest of the world have got to get awake to what is going on there and what can be done in the name of democracy and how to fight back against that. But also that the fight against the Iranian regime is part of the fight for Israel. The fight against the dictatorship in Egypt is a fight for Palestine. So you've got to link up socially, I think, the whole question of workers across the world sort of having a go. But that's a very difficult programme to put forward. I think the main thing we've got to start shattering is the illusions that the United Nations can do something, the capitalists can do something, and the only solution is for socialist policies. You've got, what's his name, Starmer, sort of 100% behind the Israeli policies, calling for a pause. A pause for what? So the guns can go quiet for a while and then they can carry on with the carpet bombing of Gaza. The only thing you've got to demand immediately is a ceasefire, a return of the troops to the barracks, and aid and assistance to be given to them, and start then talk, and also at the same time talking of a need for the working class to step in, the trade unions, the Labour Party, and all the other things, and short the rottenness of the present leadership within the Labour Party. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. Can I come in next?
Yeah, go on, Sid. I'm sure Nigel won't mind if Sean comes in next, will you know? Go on, carry on.
Dominic and myself have been having a talk, and we've decided that we'll be sending a letter to Keir Starmer, to our own MP, and also to the Mayor of Greater Manchester, who's called for a ceasefire, highlighting this little message that Netanyahu sent to his troops, that he's quoting the Bible of 3,000 years ago, which called for a total annihilation of some tribe in what was then Israel. And quite frankly, it shows that Netanyahu has told the Yanks in no uncertain terms, keep your nose out of our business, just provide us with the arms and we'll carry on. The way it's going, Biden will not be elected next year, which means that Trump will. And Trump into this mixture is a recipe for absolute disaster. Just want to raise one other issue, and it's an issue that, if you like, successive Israeli governments have brought a rod that at the end will be for their own back, and that is the settlers. The settlers are day by day encroaching on land that was designated to be Palestinian, to be the basis of this two-state solution. I don't know what percentage they have of the West Bank, but the figure I've heard is that there are 750,000 settlers in the West Bank. that after the start of the present situation, I keep getting the names mixed up, but Ben something or other, who is one of the leading ultra-right MPs in Netanyahu's government, an ultra-right minister, purchased 10,000 automatic weapons, which he's distributed to the settlers. Quite frankly, I think one of the fears that a lot of commentators have is that there will be a settler massacre of Palestinians, which would really throw in the air where the Western Europe and the United States stands in terms of its support for Israel. Because quite clearly, Netanyahu, in his little message, quoting one of the prophets, about massacring the Ammonites, is his reference to what's happening in Gaza, because he's using absolutely destructive bombing. If he's told people to go south, one incident killed 70 Palestinians on the way south when he bombed a convoy. And yesterday, it turns out that they told them to go south on the coastal road, and they were strafed by the Navy in the Mediterranean on that road. He's told them that he takes no notice of international law. Hospitals, schools, and the only Christian church in the West Bank that was sheltering several thousand people have all been bombed, and they say, well, we think there were Hamas fighters in the area, and go and piss off, because we couldn't give a toss what you liberals think. And as I say, the whole thing's in a mess. My idea of a solution would be a ceasefire followed by some form of a convention of Palestinian and Israeli people, because the Israelis blame Netanyahu for this catastrophe at the moment. They say he was totally unaware, despite the fact that 3 days before the 7th of October, the head of Egyptian intelligence personally rang Netanyahu and said, look, there's something big brewing in Gaza. And it was a day. Hamas had a day's free run on one of the tightest borders in the world to run havoc through southern Israel and kill over 1,000 people. And I mean, the Israelis are absolutely sickened by Netanyahu, but who do they put in charge to solve the problem? Netanyahu. And he's going to bomb as much as he can. If hostages are killed, then it'll be Hamas's fault. I'll leave it at that, comrades.
Okay, thanks, John. Nigel, next, please.
Thanks, Pam, and thanks everyone for your thoughtful contributions. I'm going to be a little bit more. I'm going to try and be fairly concrete here. Ciaran raised at the beginning, what can we do? Where are we and what can we do? So we can only do what we can do in the place that we are. One of the reasons we want to build an international is because we want to spread the ideas of the internationally, work internationally, as trade unionists and so on. And we're trying to do that. I think, as Pam suggested, and I'm sure comrades here have done, attending the vigils, the demonstrations, talking to people, being present. If the opportunity to speak arises, and on the events I've been to, that hasn't been really appropriate, the way the events have been organised for me to speak. But that will develop. I'm sure within a week, probably next week, there'll be opportunities for someone like me to speak, for example, because the character of the events is changing, and people are seeing a need for, political but also human kind of interaction within the events. I mean, the events I've been to, there's been a lot of people who've lost people, both on the Israel side and on the Palestinian side. So, that's very raw, that's very real. But they've been united in condemnation of how Israel's behaved. I've put a motion to my trade union branch, United Community branch, small branch, which I think is quite a good motion, got passed unanimously, which is going to go to unite. So that's one thing. I'm happy to put that in the chat. It was very strongly supported. There's a lot of disillusion with Labour. Keir Starmer's position is weakening him in the eyes of the left within his own organisation. We'll be looking at lobbying the council when they go into the council chamber in a week's time in Calderdale to try and pressure them to denounce Starmer, as Pendle and Burnley Council has done, and to ask for his removal as leader of the Labour Party. That's a concrete thing, and trying to build networks. I mean, there's already been a call in Calderdale only yesterday to have an activist network, really bringing together all of the different organisations in this area together in one network. So they're all networked with each other, and that's come out of this. Really, the feeling people have. I think it's lifted people's sense of political rage in the current situation, and that's lifted their level of kind of thinking about what to do. So there's sort of some concrete things that are actually happening at the moment. I mean, there are vigils and various events going on all over the place. I mean, around here, within just a few miles of here, there's events in different little towns. I mean, there was one just in Hebden. It's only a population of 4,000 people. There was nearly 100 people there last night in a silent vigil that lasted for an hour in the pouring rain. It was really, really incredible. Now, I'm not going to be spreading my political message necessarily, but being present, the nature of the event will change if there's another event there. The event in Halifax was a silent one, but it won't be next time. So what I'm saying is it's just a matter of intervening where we can and trying to be creative and imaginative and drawing in as many people as you can, because people are coming to these events who've never been to events before. A lot of women. I mean, last night in Hebden, it was mostly women, actually. I mean, Halifax, it was the same. It's bringing in people from backgrounds, black, Asian, white, all sorts of different kind of backgrounds. It's quite interesting that the demographic. So, those are things I think of a more concrete nature about where we are at the moment, what we can maybe try and do. Our comrades have other thoughts as well. But I think the thing for me is this is a really, really difficult area. I mean, I've been sitting with people in floods of tears over this because they've lost people they've known. It's been really difficult and upsetting. And so on a human level, that's affecting people. I think it's raising their political level, because I think those things do. People are actually being confronted with this horror, not just on the television screen, but through people they know. So those are a few. Like my colleague on the Trades Council, the chair of the Trades Council, was more or less told he couldn't go to demos by the leadership of the Labour Party, and he went anyway. And he met somebody there who'd lost his entire family in Gaza. somebody he knew. So these are just these are the sort of situations that we're seeing, and a movement things are happening. Anyway, I'll just leave it there.
Okay, thanks, Nigel. Arman, would you like to go next?
Hi. Just a couple of points I thought probably is good to raise. The issue of current scenario is, on one hand, insofar as the Palestine is concerned, is not the issue of Hamas. The knowledge about Hamas, its rule and its reaction approach, its dictatorial way of actually running things, all the rest were an issue in Gaza. That's why we had lots of demonstrations, even marches in Gaza just prior to October 7th. Hamas is gaining some potential outside the actual territories of West Bank and Gaza, because that's the only force that seemed to have done something about Israel. And that is an immediate reaction. You see it in Jordan. You see it partially in Egypt, but not a lot. And a little bit towards Lebanon, but even less than. I think the issue is not that of Hamas. The second issue, which is important, is the issue of decisions being made over and above the heads of the Palestinians. That is also another issue. Immediately, obviously, there is the issue of ceasefire and aid to Gaza and stopping the incursions in West Bank. That's obviously immediate demands. The idea is currently is how would this be resolved? I think that's one side of it. I personally think that the two-state solution is the only solution that can work. We can talk about that probably separately. The issue currently at the moment also, I think, insofar as many of us in the Western countries are concerned, is two things. Number one, there is a growing, and you can see it, unless there is a left working class approach towards this scenario, there is a right-wing approach against the Jews, a Zionist approach, if you like, to some extent, but a very, very fascist one against the Jews. That is brewing, and that's what the part of the other side, in terms of the terrorists on the Islamic side, are also brewing. There is a pressure, recognition of the fact that the backlash of this could be an anti-Jew issue. That's why I think it is very important to separate the Zionism, Judaism from that point of view, the idea of apartheid in Israel. It is important to separate that. Otherwise, there is a general growing thing that we see both from the point of view of the threat of the extreme right wing and also from the other side in terms of anti-Jewishness, from the point of view of killing Jews, if you like, which is the approach that both Israel and also probably Hamas, to a large extent, would actually put forward. That's one thing which I think is important. Second thing, which I think, I've been on all of the demos that I have tried to, and wherever you go, there is a large march, but there are always local areas where people stand up and talk. All you need is just a loudspeaker, and people stop, they listen, and they follow, and slogans take place. But what is missing, and I think that is very clear, I even saw it definitely on the one that they had in London yesterday and also across the other places. What we're missing is people who are actually on the left, people who are in the unions, but they're not with their flags. They're not with their placards. There you cannot see there anything other than the Free Palestine to a large extent. What is missing is presence of this left to be seen. When we go, we carry 4 placards and just put our own trucks and our own slogans forward. I think that is one thing which has to be done. 2, there is huge anger. There's huge anger among many that you go by against Sunak, against Ciaran, and effectively against all political establishments. And that is an anti-establishment movement that you can see that people do not trust the politicians. And that is not being addressed to a large extent in terms of not just the fact that they are hand in hand with the Israeli state and they are effectively complicit in the issue of war crimes. But the idea is, how people actually raise their hands. And I think that's, again, where they're looking to the left. So part of this is, what I'm trying to say is, the activities which is to do with the issue of Palestine and the issue of what is happening in Gaza. But part of it is also, there should be a difference between a socialist organization, let's say, for example, in UK, in France, in Ireland, in anywhere else, to many people who actually go and say we are against Israel. They expect something to be done locally and nationally in the individual countries. And that's one thing which I think sometimes gets missing. I'll leave it as that for the moment. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Salman. I'm just going to bring Nikos in next because he's not spoken yet. If anybody else wants to say anything who's not spoken, could you put your hand up? And then I will bring you back in, Ian. I know you're dying to get back in and make some further points. So if we go for Nikos next, please.
Okay, comrades, thanks. Just some comments to this really interesting discussion. First of all, I think the horror that the Palestinian people face these days is I don't know how to characterize it, and it has provoked a wave of solidarity across the globe. I think it's the first time since a number of years that we have seen big anti-war marches in a lot of countries. And I think it's important. This is an important factor and will be an important factor. And this is something we should generally invest on, since the situation is not going to become better anytime soon in the area. And in general, the fact that so we had Ukraine 2 years ago, and now there's a kind of like, it seems that this war may become something like a second regional conflict, which has international character, and then we could have something similar happening in Africa with developments in the Sahel area. So we will definitely need an anti-war movement of a generalized character, and I think this is an important point for our intervention and the way we see that. This also has to do with the general geopolitical repercussions of this conflict. So as we have seen in the Ukraine war, there's a war going on, but then the international blocs that are fighting for international domination align with different parts of this war. So it seems also from the discussion in the UN General Assembly that the China and Russia part, and countries that are aligned to it, do not fall in line with the US line in this war. And then the US also tries to consolidate its Western allies around it. And this will definitely play a role, even though both camps, I think, are hesitant to kind of like turn it into a new international war in the area, because they see the problem, the repercussions that this may have. But at the same time, this will generally play into the battle for domination, for world domination. And in general, I think we should note that at least in the in the popular layers across the globe, this will be another blow to the U.S. hegemony. The idea that U.S. Sets the tone in international relations, because the fact that the Palestinian struggle is something that a lot of people know and a lot of people show solidarity with, and I think it's going to be another blow to the prestige of the US and its Western allies. At the same time, I think we should, another point, I think we should notice the fact that although Israel has a huge military superiority, they seem really hesitant to actually engage in the military occupation of Gaza. And I think one important thing to note here is Biden's statement. I don't know how many comrades saw that. He said that Israel should not act out of anger, and he actually mentioned the US invasion of Afghanistan, and he actually said that it was kind of a mistake from the US to engage in an actual war on the ground in Afghanistan, and in that way he was pressuring Israel not to to be very hesitant in this. And I think there are a lot of superpowers that thought they could easily win smaller enemies, but they were engaged in situations which they couldn't really come out victorious out of, and Afghanistan was the case. So in a way, this could be a more drawn-out conflict. It could last for several months, and I think it's, although Israel has a huge military superiority and has the support of the US, I'm not sure how they can easily come out of that victorious. So I think these are all playing in the situation. So one thing about our position that I think was mentioned in this discussion, and I think it's important, of course, for us it's important to raise our criticism of Hamas and its general political line and the way they function, the terrorist character of some of their action, and their Islamic fundamentalist principles. But at the same time, I think it's important for us to show understanding to people that support, in a way, because Hamas has mass support in the area, in the way that they are the only ones who are fighting in the eyes of these people. Hamas are the only ones who are fighting against the occupation. And of course, that is a problem of the left in the area. You know, it's a historic problem of the left, of Stalinism and its policies and the forces it has in the area, which left the left actually was diminished in the area, and the only fighting force now are the Islamic fundamentalist forces. So while at the same time we should publicly, not restrain ourselves from criticizing Hamas, at the same time I think it's important for us to show understanding to people and understand why they support, or in a way, or maybe support or somewhat align themselves with these political movements or parties. My last point is about I think we should also publicly expose the leaders of the Arab countries, which say that they are in favor of the Palestinian struggle, while at the same time not doing anything. So Sisi in Egypt, he organized state-funded marches in favor of Israel, and which they say, free Palestine and hail Sisi, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, he says that it's a security threat. So allowing Palestinian refugees, even at this time, is a security threat to Egypt. And of course, he does this because he doesn't want a mass refugee camps in Egypt, because that will put the Palestinian problem on his side. But it's definitely hypocritical. And other leaders also. I was listening today to Raisi, the president of Iran, which he was criticizing Israel for banning social media in Gaza, which Iran does all the time against its own people. So it's important for us to expose these differences, because there are some in the left that say, more or less openly support all those against imperialism, which of course is not is a totally wrong position. So my last point, this was the one before the last, is about this idea on how we approach the solution. There was some discussion about the one state or two state, but I think the most important thing behind this is how we approach people who are asking for a solution. And for us, the most important factor is how we engage in discussion with people having national aspirations. And I think both Palestinians and Israeli working class people we should allow for them, if they openly declare that, to have their own state. And of course, there are difficult issues around this, and Ciaran, both in his speech and also in his recent article takes up some of them, and I think it's interesting to go in this discussion. But the most crucial element to open a discussion to these people, and especially as comrades noted, we will be engaged in discussions in mobilizations around this issue, is a position that could allow us to open discussion with both Palestinian progressive people and Israeli progressive people about their national aspiration. And of course, we should condemn the idea of Palestinians raising for the destruction of the state of Israel. So they're proposing kind of like a one-state solution only for Palestinians. And of course, we should oppose the idea that Israelis should be the only ones having one state and Palestinians will just be second-class citizens in this state. So I think the logic behind this is allowing us to openly discuss with people and raising our ideas about the way forward. So thanks, comrades.
Thank you, Nikos. Right, I'm going to bring Ian back in now. Now it's 5:30. We've got about 30 minutes left. So if anybody wants to come in after Ian, please put your hand up. So I want to give Ciaran a bit of time to sum up, about 10 minutes or so. Ciaran, would that be okay? Just trying to spot you on my screen. Right, that's okay. Okay, Ian.
Yeah, a few disconnected things that I'll try and go through as quick as possible. I had a little more maybe to say about the one state, two state debate, but I'll start by since I was first replying to some of the other questions that came up after I'd finished speaking. I think there were some great fighting contributions from Peter and Dom and John. I think maybe to correct myself to an extent when I said that they blinked from full-scale genocide, I simply meant in terms of emptying the Gaza Strip entirely, in the way that did happen to Nagorno-Karabakh not that long ago. I think in other definitions, including official UN definitions, there is a genocidal violence going on in Gaza, and that we shouldn't be soft in any way on that, and I hope I wasn't. But I think that there's a difference in terms of the Palestinians with their particular history of Nakba, not wanting to move. Also, Israel says, as some people pointed out, go south and then they bomb the south, leave Gaza, then they bomb the only checkpoint that they don't control to Gaza. So, yeah, in a way, it's a lot more violent, even if it's not emptying the strip, than what happened in Armenia. Replying to some of what Finn said, I thought it was a really heady brew of good and bad points, comrade. The good, it was important to note the strong working class left history going right back to the Arab revolt starting as a general strike, the prominence of the left in the Palestinian movement, some of the joint actions and strikes in the early days of the State of Israel I didn't actually know about, and is an encouraging legacy to build on, an important part of history to highlight. And I think that's all worth noting, as well as the failure of the left leading to Hamas. I think it's worth saying I don't support Hamas, not because Suella Braverman told me not to by law, but because politically, why would I support a right-wing Islamic nationalist organization? That's a great shame that the left groups that were used to be the leadership of the Palestinian struggle, often led by members of the Christian minority, or with that minority prominent within them, have been eclipsed by a much more particularist operation at the current time. But I think some of the stuff about the Muslim Brotherhood's origins, you're right, Finn, in terms of its general reaction going back to Al-Banna. Some of the stuff about it wanting to overturn the Egyptian democracy after the revolution, in a way they were more the victims of that under Sisi. Stuff about wanting to take over the world. I think whatever they might want, this is totally rhetorical. There's no way they could achieve that under the balance of forces. So I think that can be a bit hypothetical or even hysterical to talk about it in that way. Interestingly, although they've never come out for a two-state solution themselves, Hamas have talked about a 50-year truce with Israel, which would be effectively the same thing. I think in terms of the actual balance of forces, as opposed to some world Islamist revolution, a two-state solution would be their best chance at getting any kind of Sharia law, which would be very bad for the substantial Christian minority and the secular left within Palestine, but completely unachievable on the basis of an actual one-state solution, which also involves 50% of the population roughly 50% of the population being Israeli Jews. In terms of one state, two state, would it have to be a unitary state? It's worth noting South Africa is a unitary state. That was part of the Mandela negotiation, that there wouldn't be a federation with white areas and black areas and so on. I think that was progressive, even if not everything else in that negotiation on the economy obviously wasn't progressive. But there are other models, and I think a binational state might be sensible. A federation on the kind of old Yugoslav or Soviet lines. But in terms of it having to be socialist, the forces of socialism on the ground right now are very weak, and it seems like a generational challenge almost to build them up again to a leadership role. And I don't think that we can wait. I do remember what Lenin said about the Easter Rising, that we can't wait for a perfect socialist revolution, because then we'll never live to see one. And I think that a one-state solution, even if it was initially capitalist, would be a great step forward in dismantling apartheid. And I think there is growing Jewish support for it in the Jewish community, especially in the United States, which is the world's largest, and also people inside Israel starting to question the fundamentals of their state, which, when that kind of process starts, often takes on a life of its own and goes surprisingly quickly, for better or for worse, as we saw in the Soviet Union and South Africa. So I think that is something that we should be supporting or raising. I think if there's a negotiated two-state solution that's just, that allows the right of return and so on, that could be a short stepping stone to a one-state solution, but it's been effectively killed by the settlers for 30 years. I'm sure there was other things that I wanted to say, but I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ciaran. We go to Jimmy now, please. Are you having trouble? Oh, you found it.
I'm having trouble with the mouse. It's strike. No, I just wanted to pick up a word that Ian used there. He made some critical comment about Islamic. I can't remember the whole context of what followed it, but it was a use of the word Islamic to describe the movement. In the present situation, where the mass media has been bombarded with anti-Islam and anti-Muslim propaganda, some of it quite disgusting stuff. I would ask that comrades exercise a bit of consciousness, the use of the word Islamic as against Islamist. To me, everybody who comes from the Muslim or Islamic tradition is entitled to practice the beliefs of Islamism or Islamic religions. The guy I don't like, and I won't give any credence to, is the Islamist, the guy who wants to shove it down my throat. The same with any religion. You have the right to practice, but don't enforce it on me, or don't try to enforce the rules and conditions on society. But I would ask the comrades just to exercise that little bit of caution in defining the difference between the two, the religion and the zealot. That's all, comrades.
Okay, thanks, Jimmy. Finn.
I did just want to make a comment about the one state and two state discussion. We shouldn't get into too much detail in this regard. We can only make some general points. So we stand for the national rights of peoples. How that's to be resolved is difficult to pin it down. The settlement that came after the Sykes-Picot Agreement did not create a state for Palestinians. It did create other states, obviously, Jordan and Iraq, but Palestinians were left out of state formation. And the British mandate, which was given by the League of Nations, was to allow for the creation of a Palestinian state. And within that state, possibly, because this was all that was suggested in Balfour, it was a homeland rather than a state, was that the Jews could be accommodated in some kind of state formation in that region. The Jewish people got a state, it became Israel. Palestinians did not. So that promise of Palestinian statehood was not honoured. Now, that's an important point to make. Breaking it down into whether it should be one state, two states is different. I mean, there's a democratic right, national rights, which we stand for. How that's to be resolved is difficult to pin it down. We stand for human rights, rights of organisation, rights of community. We stand for control of resources, for people's industrialisation policy, food production, energy control. All these things would be encompassed in a national formation. That's what the nation does. It allows for control over resources and allows for rights. So that if we stand for that, we shouldn't get too bogged down on which is the better, the one state or the two state. I agree that the most likely outcome in the immediate term would probably be some kind of two-state solution. But we need to be clear the kind of two states. There's different interpretations of that. If there were to be two states, each state has to have democratic rights, openness, freedom of association, freedom of expression, and so on. So I just wanted to make that point. We shouldn't get too tied up in the detail. How things resolve, it's hard to say in advance. We have to only call for the establishment of general principles. I'm not sure what Jimmy's point about Islamist and Islamic, the distinction there. There's not the slightest question whatever about the whole world becoming an Islamic republic. That's a stupid fantasy by the founders of the Muslim Brotherhood. But we should note that that is a principal demand today of Hamas. Hamas want to turn Israel, as it now exists, into an Islamic state. I mean, apart from it being divisive, it's absolutely stupid. It's a foolish and absolutely impossible of realization. But they call for an Islamic republic. So they use the word Islamic. Islamic jihad is called Islamic jihad. I wasn't aware of the distinction Jimmy's making about Islamist and Islamic. I'm not sure. I mean, we stand for the rights to practice religion. Whatever religion somebody has, they're entitled to practice their religion. How they describe it, I don't know, I hadn't thought sufficiently about the distinction between Islamic and Islamist. But people are entitled to be Muslims if they chose. But that's a different question from, as Jimmy said, shoving it down somebody's throat. And the Islamic Republic, such as exists, or such as is supposed to exist in Iran, and such as Hamas are calling for, we're opposed to. So whether it's I would describe Hamas as an active jihadist organization, and jihad, of course, is a derivation from activities conducted within the traditions of Islam. So I just don't want to get too bogged down in details. We have to stand for the national rights of Palestinian people, such as they expected in the settlement of the establishment of nation states after World War I. It was excluded from that. And ever since then, that area has been exploited by the West and exploited by, particularly in more recent times, by the United Nations. And just one final point, that there was an earlier period when Palestinians were led by aristocratic feudal families that lived in Palestine. So there's a terrible tradition of leadership in the Palestinian movement. The two main families that, the feudal families, the Nashashibis and the Husseinis, were right-wing feudal landlords. And one of them, Amin Husseini, was appointed by the British as a mufti. He was called the mufti, which is leader of all of Arabs, he interpreted it. And then he had a discussion with Mussolini and with Hitler, and they discussed and agreed that the two main enemies were Judaism and communism. So they were also leading Palestinian movement. So going right back, there's a terrible history of leadership. And I would say today's leadership, which Hamas pretends to be representing at the present time, even though it does reflect disillusionment with the PLO and Al-Fatah and the failure to solve problems, I accept that that's where they came from. But the fact that they are where they are is a disaster for Palestinians. There's no way forward whatsoever under their leadership, even though we understand where they came from. So that's why we need to spell out the issues: poverty, unemployment, human rights, the right to participate in elections, the right to be consulted about issues that affect you, control over resources, which involves nationalisation and socialist policies. These are the things we need to focus upon, not on what a group calls themselves. Thanks, comrades.
Okay, thanks, Finn. Well, we're starting to run out of time. There's 3 hands up, so if the remaining 3 people could just keep the remarks as brief as possible. I'm going to take Patrick first because he's not spoken, and then Dominic, and then Aman, and then we're going to go back to Ciaran for us to wig up. So, Patrick, you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you. I think, well, some short remarks. In Sweden, at least, the demonstrations regarding the war now has been dominated by groups leaning towards Hamas, one would have to say, with supporting the demands to eradicate the Israeli state. So at least for us, it has been very important to be very clear that we do not support the Islamists. Of course, starting with criticizing the Israeli violence and so on, but it's very important to have a very clear line towards people who are leaning towards Hamas. That's one thing. The other thing that Nikos asked, that's very interesting. How is the Israeli state planning the future? And there was one leak in one of the Israeli papers saying that there had been discussion on getting rid of all the Arab people from Gaza, rebuilding an entire new city somewhere in the Sinai desert, just getting rid of people from Gaza. And that was, maybe that line doesn't win the discussion within the Israeli establishment, but that just shows how far they are prepared to go. Other discussions have, of course, been to get rid of Hamas, go in, get rid of Hamas, crush Hamas, and then say to the UN that now Israel doesn't have any responsibility for Gaza anymore. Now the UN should take care of Gaza. And one last remark, I think reading about what's happening and trying to understand, for me, it's been kind of interesting to think about the nature of the Israeli state. Because when the Israeli state was founded, Trotskyite socialists said, the Jews are not a nation, it's a religion. They don't share the same, they don't share the history, they don't share the language, and they don't share the culture because they come from all over the world. Still, they got a country, and they had what really joined them together was the Holocaust, and then after that, several wars that also kind of joined the Israeli society together. But that's kind of a negative way of creating a nation. It's not an organic way of a nation to kind of evolve. It's a negative way. And if you look at the Israeli state, it's a very strange mix of different things. On the one hand, you have very modern people dancing, young people dancing on some rave party. You have, high technology stuff. You have freedom of speech. You have a multi-party system. You have the right of organizing unions and so on. On the other hand, ever since the start of Israel, the ultra-Orthodox Jews were given exceptional powers. Every marriage in Israel has to be okayed by the ultra-Orthodox Jews. They're kind of high priests or something like this. 10% of Israel's population is ultra-Orthodox Jews, and half of the men among these people, they don't have to go to work. They are paid by the Israeli state, not just to do nothing, just read the Torah and do nothing. It's like the taxpayers' money is used to kind of conserve a very reactionary force. It's really compared then to on the one hand, you have a very modern society with some also traits of a modern state. But on the other hand, you have these very strange things with huge powers for the ultra-Orthodox, with 5% of the population being paid to read the Torah and do nothing else but that.
Patrick, can I ask you to just start summing up because we are running out? Obviously, this is very interesting. We could do with listening to it for a lot longer, but we do need to start drawing the meeting to a close. Thank you.
And also, I would finish. I don't have a point, but also in the bottom lies that the Israeli state is kind of the agent of the US and of imperialism in this area of the world, which also kind of colors and change and this kind of makes the Israeli state into something strange. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Patrick. Okay, John or Dominic, then Arman, if we could just remind you, Pete, to be as concise as possible, please, to allow Ciaran some time to reply. So John or Dominic first.
Dominic, yeah, just a quick point. I hope it's going to be quick anyway. It's just a point that Ian made about, we can't wait for a socialist solution and all that. I mean, I don't think Lenin had that attitude in July. He waited till October. The point is that, as far as I could remember, you've had organisations that have been trying to fight against global warming, against all sorts of things. And the main speaker usually says, we can't wait for socialism, we have to get on with it now. And all it happens is nothing. The point is that the only way, and I tried to touch on it when I was speaking before, where are these other forces that are going to do anything about the situation in Gaza? Not the capitalists, not the feudal lords, not the anybody's. It's only going to be the working class, and whether that working class is dispersed and unorganised is something that's got to be taken up. And that's what surely we're all about. You don't solve solutions by saying we have got to do something. Who's the we?
Thanks, Dominic. Arman?
Right. There are quite a few points, but I just wanted to just mention one thing, and that is the whole idea of thinking about the issue of Israel and Palestine has different repercussions in different places. If I just wanted to just mention this, for example, if you are in Iran, where the state is, at the moment at least anyway, working with or blowing its horn for Hamas, protest against the situation in Israel works very differently. I just saw this a point of interest just to see, for example, to have a state which actually does calls for annihilation of Israel, though I don't think they actually really mean it. I just think it's just rhetoric. Islamic Republic needs Israel as much as Israel needs Islamic Republic. But the interesting thing is, from the working point of view, working class point of view, from the masses who actually want to protest their disgust at the situation of Gaza, and not wanting to be called as part and parcel of the ruling state's propaganda, the situation for us works slightly differently. So it's just a point of interest just to put down in a situation, because then you can see how part of the working class in Jordan, and to some extent even in Egypt, would react differently to what we might see in the West, and their actions against Israel takes a different form rather than what we see in the West. That's all. Just thought it might be interesting just to note that.
Okay, thanks very much, John. Right, Roger did have his hand up at one point, but I think we lost him a little while ago, so unfortunately we can't take his contribution. So Ian, can we go back to you? Sorry, Ciaran, can we go back to you now for a sort of brief response, if that's possible? Trying to find you. Oh, you're there, yeah. Right.
Yes, okay, well, thank you, Pat. Yes, I was looking forward to hearing from Roger, but I think he disappeared a long time ago.
Yeah, he did, yeah.
So, a very good discussion. Just a man's last point, just quickly, how the repercussions of this conflict are worldwide, but as a man says, it's different in different places. And I've mentioned this before, but just to mention again, where I live in Belfast, there are Israeli flags flying from the lampposts in the Protestant working class areas, and Palestinian flags flying from the lampposts in Catholic working class areas, because of the identification with the conflict with the communities, which is very real. It's very visceral. It's felt, and that means that any intervention here into any demonstration, that has to be taken into consideration. Just like a man said, it varies from place to place. The issues, I can't deal with all of the issues, but just to pick, I think I picked three themes. One is our attitude to Hamas. I mean, I agree essentially with Finn's points. We have to take quite a hard approach. We recognize that the Palestinian masses, the Palestinian residents of Gaza, have the right to resist. They have the right to fight back. Above all else, they have the right to self-defense. But that doesn't mean we simply alibi the force, which for now, because it's temporary, which has come to the fore in any way. We don't in any way give any credence of support to Hamas. And some on the left do, because they won't criticize Hamas because it's a resistance movement. It cannot be criticized. That's not our position. And the actions of Hamas have had the opposite effect. The actions of Hamas don't in any way defend the Palestinian masses, the Palestinian residents of Gaza, and don't advance their cause in any way. Now it is complicated. One comrade has already mentioned that Hamas, Ian, I think Hamas, from its charter in the late 1980s, it stands for the eradication of Israel from the face of the earth and a single Islamic state in its place. But it has also raised the question of a truce lasting between 10 years and 100 years. It's prepared to have a 100-year truce in some of its writings, whatever that means. But it's widely taken to mean that in some scenarios, it would be prepared to accept a two-state solution of its own making. In that, again said, the Israeli or the Palestinian state then would be an Islamic state for it. And it's complicated in many ways. And for me, I don't know, none of us know, and we never will, whether the 1,000 Hamas fighters who died on October the 7th actually believe in the Hamas charter, actually believe in Islamic fundamentalism, or they simply took up a gun and joined the one force that seemed to be fighting back, and that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to hit back. To me, it seems unlikely that all those young men believed the promise, but perhaps I'm wrong. But we know that Hamas are a barrier. They're a barrier in terms of the advancement of the rights of the Palestinian masses. In terms of solutions, this question of a solution under capitalism, I mean, Ian made a whole series of very important points. I didn't say that anything's impossible in the sense, is a unitary state impossible under capitalism? It's not impossible. Is a two-state formation impossible under capitalism? It's not impossible. Well, the point I was trying to make is that what is impossible is a lasting solution, a solution, anything that actually solves the problems of the Palestinian people or the Israeli people. That's the distinct difference. We know under capitalism, there can be important developments such as the end of apartheid. That happened, and it didn't require the socialist revolution. We know that under capitalism, forced population movements provide a solution, in inverted commas, as in Nagorno-Karabakh, and as many times in history. And we know that a single unitary state under capitalism can only come about through a process of profound change. And the type of profound positive change that we're in favour of a growing together, of a coming together of peoples, is very unlikely under capitalism. So a single unitary state under capitalism would only arise, I think, in the context of the defeat of Israel, the defeat of the Israeli state in some sense, whatever that might mean exactly, or a complete transformation of the ideology and the outlook of the Israeli state. So it was no longer a Zionist state. Zionism had been defeated, as Peter put it, and then the Israeli majority of the Israeli population have a new outlook and are prepared to enter into a unitary state. And all of that unfolding under capitalist power relations, with all of the scarcity that we know exists under capitalism. It's not totally excluded, but it's very close to being totally excluded, in my opinion. More likely is some form of two-state arrangement under capitalism. I think that's not just likely, but entirely possible in the next period. In the aftermath of this war, well, what might happen? I mean, it is possible in Israel that there will be a general uprising against Netanyahu and his government. Netanyahu is a discredited figure. He's corrupt. He already had a mass movement that he was struggling to deal with against the changes in the legal system. He didn't have majority support. He reliant on extreme right-wing parties that represent a tiny proportion of the population. So in the next period, the next 6 months, the next year, 2 years, with rising military casualties, with revulsion of the number of Palestinian casualties, because many Israelis are, they don't support the collective punishment of the Palestinians. With the sense that the Netanyahu government did not protect us. And if Zionism is about anything, it's about a secure state where Israelis can live in peace and stability after centuries of persecution. So if the Netanyahu government can't deliver that, if Zionism can't deliver that, it's possible there will be the overthrow not just of the government, but new elections where centrist parties or new parties thrown up by events could come to power, and you could have a very different situation then. And similarly, in the West Bank and Gaza, there may be new power relations might develop. The US imperialism might decide to really push for a solution, to pour resources into the area. The Gulf nations, with all of their vast resources, they try and push resources into the area. And you have a two-state solution where it's not just, as Ian put it, an Israeli state and a Bantustan, but an Israeli state and some kind of a bolstered, semi-developed Palestinian state, which for a period of time might appear to be an advance and for a period of time might restabilize the situation. But when I say for a period, 3 years, 5 years, not even 10, 15 or 20 years, I think that's possible. But again, it's very unlikely. And we should never argue to working people that have to wait for socialism for any immediate demand, for a wage rise, for peace, for security, for stability. But we also have to be honest, as the comrades already put it, that sometimes there is no alternative. There is no immediate solution. And Lenin's point in 1916 was that the 1916 rebellion was too early, was too soon. The implication is that if Lenin had been asked for counsel, for advice, he would have said to wait. He would have said to wait for the socialist revolution. That's the implication. But then he said, but when it occurred, when it happened, of course he supported it, because he wasn't going to wait forever and a day for the pure revolution. That was his attitude towards it. But I think a lot of important points you made, Ian, about a binational state and other arrangements. And arrangements, we have to be open to the possibility of new arrangements under capitalism. In Ireland, for example, new arrangements are possible, but they won't provide a solution, because the instability will remain, the clash of national identities will remain, and the competition for scarce resources will remain. And we have to remain absolutely focused on the role of the organised working class to provide the solution, even at times like this, when it seems very unlikely. And there are historical analogies, and they're not exact analogies, but in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, for example, the end of the Troubles as we knew them in the mid-1990s, to a large part was down to the war weariness and the anti-war, the anti-parliamentary campaign movement that developed in both communities, Catholic and Protestant communities. The working class moved. That's part of the reason why we got the Good Friday Agreement, which was a temporary restabilization of the situation. Lebanon, where there's 25 years of civil war, which seemed like it would never end, and then there was a peace agreement, which was just a temporary sticking plaster. But then we had the general strike of the Lebanese working class in the 1980s, in the end of the 1980s, and further general strikes in the 1990s. The working class did, for a period of time, return to the stage of history, and that's what we have to believe in Israel and Palestine, and we have to do our best to assist. Several comrades have referenced the fact that the Palestinian masses have a very poor leadership currently with Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, a poor leadership historically of Fatah and the PLO. But many times, the majority of the Palestinian masses have looked to left parties with flaws, but left parties nevertheless, generally linked to the Soviet Union or linked to China or linked to other to foreign worker states. And again, we have to hold out the possibility that at some point in the near future there'll be an overthrow of the current regimes and a return to a sense that socialism is the only way forward for the Palestinian masses. And in that, international developments are very important. In Northern Ireland during the 1970s, there's more than once we teetered on the brink of civil war. Civil war was possible, or could even be argued that civil war had begun, the early stages of a civil war. But international developments are very important. So in the 1970s, for example, the time of the Angolan Revolution, the time of the Vietnamese Revolution, the revolution in Portugal, the end of the Franco regime, all of those events had an impact on events in Ireland and in Northern Ireland, which meant that young people in particular looked outside what was seen a very bleak situation for inspiration. Young people became involved then in socialist groups and in the trade union movement. And that is part of the reason why the workers' movement was able to hold the line. And I think the same thing can happen in Israel and Palestine. So internal despair and nihilism and a sense of desperation it can in time be turned against the government, the governing powers in both Israel and Palestine, and looking outside the states for inspiration from other places can be very important. And our role is to assist in those developments, assist in every ember, just any sign of hope, any new development parties, any trade unions, as in Nigel's very good motion. We reach out and we try and build whatever links we can. And I think organically in Israel and Palestine and in the region, the best workers, the best activists will instinctively want to reach across the borders and the fences. And we have to encourage them and assist them in that type of work. So a very good discussion, which you should come back to. But I'll finish there now. It's nearly 6:05, so we're well over our time.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Ciaran, for your lead off and your summing up. And, thanks for everybody that came in and made really, really, useful and thought-provoking contributions to the discussion. We will, of course, be going back to this because this situation it will not go away anytime soon. But that's the end of the discussion for this week. But we're going to break with tradition. We don't have Roger. So this week we're going to Nikos, who is going to talk about next week's meeting. Where are you, Nikos? Here somewhere.
Yeah.
You're still here, right? Yeah, hello.
Okay, just shortly, comrades, that last week we had a really important victory for the anti-fascist movement in Greece. We were able to cancel the pan-European neo-Nazi rally that was organized for the last months. Anti-fascists were able to march in Athens even while there was a police ban, while fascists were not. So this is a huge victory, and we also thank all comrades here that helped or sent solidarity messages or protest letters. That also played an important role. So this is the idea to develop this information more on next week's WIN meeting, and also discuss about the far right and neo-Nazism in Greece, how it grew during the crisis, how we were able to counter it, and how Golden Dawn was declared a criminal organization, and how they are now trying to regroup again, and then link this issue to the global trend of the rise of the far right and these kind of forces, and how the working class movement can deal with that. So that's the general idea about next